Welcome back, everybody. Part 2 of chapter 6 as we continue our deep dive into television. Obviously, in pardon me, in part 1, we spent a lot of time talking about the numbers and the money and the amount of people that this form of mass communication reaches, and it's pretty impressive. For this part, for part 2, we're going to talk about history in many ways and the evolution of television. And of course, we can't do that without starting way back in the 19th century. So we're talking about the novelty stage of television. Excuse me while I cough here for a second. Anyway, TV's earliest pioneers were trying to isolate TV waves from the electromagnetic spectrum. What's interesting is, remember when we go back to radio, that obviously radio's development had a lot to do with, it had its roots apparently in the telegraph, right? In, first of all, the instant communication, wired instant communication, then it was wireless, right? And so there was this idea that if you could carry a voice wirelessly across the ether, right, then why not a visual signal? And so that's why TV, I don't think, really can ever say that it would ever come along if not for radio. They all kind of build off each other. So anyway, from 1897 to 1908, the development by several inventors of the cathode ray tube combined principles of camera and electricity. Okay. Inventors and technicians developed a method of encoding images at a transmission point, which would be a TV station, and decoding them at a reception point, which is your television set in your living room. All right, so who started working on this stuff? Well, there's a series of gentlemen here I want to introduce you to. The first one is a German inventor by the name of Paul Nipkow, all right? And basically, he developed the scanning disc, which separated pictures into pinpoints of light that could be transmitted as a series of electronic lines, okay? And as the disc spun, each small hole scanned one line of a scene to be televised. His invention served as the foundation for future experiments. So really, Paul Nipkow was one of the first, and certainly one of the most important engineers / inventors to really have a hand in developing television. The next was a guy named Vladimir Zworykin, who was actually, you can see, was on planet Earth for quite a long time, from 1888 to 1982. He, in Russia in 1907, worked in a lab that improved on Nipkow's scanning device. Now, eventually, he came to the US in 1919. So that would have made him, what, about 30 years old, right? And went to work for Westinghouse and RCA. Zworykin invented the iconoscope, the first TV camera tube to convert light rays into electrical signals, and he patented that in 1928. So Vladimir Zworykin is a key figure in television's development, but he and another gentleman who I'm about to introduce you to, got into a protracted legal battle, which we'll talk about. So the third gentleman, who I think is probably the most fascinating, honestly, of the three that I've introduced you to, his name is Philo Farnsworth. And I'm going to play a video here for you that where I guess the tagline is, he's the most famous person you've never heard of. But he, covering his 65 years or so on planet Earth, he in high school came up with the idea for for television, for modern television, on a chalkboard in Idaho. He transmitted the first electronic TV picture and eventually had to contact his high school teacher to later approve the patent for his invention. I've got a video here, by the way, I'm going to share with you. And I think this might be the only one that YouTube lets me play, and doesn't knock me for quote unquote copyright. But it's his granddaughter, either his granddaughter or great-granddaughter, Jessica, basically does a story about Philo and why he is so important to television's history. I just think what I find fascinating about this, before I play this story, is that anytime someone comes up with a really amazing invention that has not been kind of seen before, it's amazing how people will be somewhat reluctant to think that it works. I always think about the guy that created FedEx, the idea behind, FedEx, overnight shipping. And, he actually was a student, I want to say at the University of Memphis, if I'm not mistaken. He was a business student. That was actually his senior thesis, and the teacher at the time gave him a D because he thought that that was not practical. Anyway, I'm on a tangent, but let me share with you the screen here real quick, and show you what we got here. Share screen. All right. Let's go to this right here, and here's Philo.
My great-grandfather really was the most famous man no one's ever heard of.
Now, we're not going to identify this contestant panel because to identify him would be to tip off his secret. We will call him simply Dr. X. Now, Doctor, if you will whisper your secret to me, we will show it at the same time to the folks out there.
Is this some kind of a machine that might be painful when it's used?
Yeah, sometimes it's most painful.
This is the famous Dr. Philo T. Farnsworth, who invented electronic television. And sir, how old were you when you invented television, or the first television machine as we know it today, first television system?
I was 14.
14 years old.
It's hard to imagine the world my great-grandfather was born into in 1906. No computers, no cell phones, no cars, no airplanes, and certainly no television. When he was growing up in a log cabin in rural Utah, his primetime entertainment was staring at the moon and dreaming of the future. An electric generator and a stack of science fiction magazines fueled young Philo's imagination. Then, in 1920, at the age of 14, while harrowing a field behind a team of horses, he had a revelation. If he could train an electron to do what horses were doing and go to the end of a row, turn around, and start over, he could send pictures through the air. The next year he entered high school, and he tried to talk his way into a senior science class by describing his dream of an all-electronic television. His teacher had no idea what he was talking about, but agreed to tutor him and saved the very first drawing of a television camera. By 19, Phil had attracted investors, built a lab in San Francisco, and proposed to his sweetheart, Elma.
He says, "There's another woman in my life." Well, before I could faint, he said, "And her name is television." The only way I see that we would have as much time together as I'd like is if you work with me. How about it?
On September 7th, 1927, with my great-grandma at his side taking notes, Philo successfully transmitted an electronic image for the first time.
I was so excited I was dancing around, and Phil was, I knew from the shaking hands that he was very emotionally impacted. But he said, "Well, there you've got television." That was what he said. The backers said, "Farnsworth, when are we going to see some money in this thing?" Phil had painted a $sign on a slide, and that's the first thing they saw, was a $sign.
By 1934, he was ready to demonstrate television for the first time. Philadelphia's Franklin Institute was overflowing with people wanting to see his new miracle. Although the screen was only about a foot in diameter, the crowds were transfixed and refused to leave.
We didn't realize how hard it was to keep live pictures going on television yet. We had everything from trained dogs and bears, ventriloquists and puppet shows. And there was one clear night and a full moon, and Phil turned it on the moon, and that got more of a response from the public than anything. The headline was, "The moon sits for its first portrait."
Take a picture of the moon above in May or June, then you can make a love morning, night, or noon by the light of the same old moon.
Popular Science presents a backstage preview of television, the newest miracle of modern electrical engineering. Technicians in the Farnsworth, Philadelphia laboratories have helped to make television, the dazzling dream of the decade, a practical reality today. Mr. Philo T. Farnsworth, shown at the right, is working on the image dissector tube, a photoelectric camera tube of his own invention that distinguishes his system of television from others. It is said to be responsible for the most clearly defined television pictures. Placed in the circuit of this receiving system is a funnel-shaped cathode tube. The round, flat surface of its bulb becomes the picture screen in studio monitor sets, as well as in home receiving sets. The image dissector tube and the cathode oscillite tube are the heart and brain of the Farnsworth system. Television engineers are now adjusting studio equipment to demonstrate the technical routine of broadcasting a television program. Max Factor Jr. has developed a new type makeup for television photography. The photoelectronic camera, being supersensitive to red, causes that color to be absorbed. Thus, red is applied to hollows and depressions of the face to eliminate heavy lines and also to produce highlights. While blue, which reproduces darkly, is used as eyeshadow. The facial makeup of the modern movie queen makes her a dream of loveliness, but the television star has the grotesque appearance of a circus clown. The new television makeup may give the camera a break, but the wearer's first view of herself is likely to break her heart, unless she has a sense of humor. In this camera is an image dissector tube. The camera lens picks up the artist as an image of light, causing electrodes in the dissector tube to emit electrons. Passing through station equipment, the electrons become radio impulses to be broadcast and picked up by receiving sets where the routine is reversed. The radio impulses becoming points of light that appear on the screen as pictures. 30 pictures are completed every second. These pictures are composed of 200,000 light points that strike the screen one at a time at the rate of 6 million points per second. Music and sound accompany the performer's action, both visible and audible elements going on the air in perfect synchronization. As the action is photographed from various angles, engineers at control boards select long shots and close-ups, editing the show as it passes instantly through the station's facility. Traveling with the speed of light through a maze of tubes and equipment, the show leaves the station's sending towers to be viewed by the television public, an audience as yet small and comparatively ignorant of the enormous research and experiment that makes it possible for us to see and hear people many miles away. The most fanciful dream of mankind is today a startling reality, destined to become the world's most popular science.
The RCA said no person, no boy of 15 could come up with that complicated concept. So Phil went to the patent office and he said, we need a ruling on this. They asked Phil if he had told anyone about his television ideas. Phil's old chemistry teacher, Justin Tolman, produced a page of Phil's notebook where Phil had made a drawing of the camera tube. And so RCA had to give in on that idea. Therefore, they made a ruling that Farnsworth was the original inventor of electronic television. He said this is the first time RCA has ever taken a license.
This would be the place for a happy ending, except for a tragic twist of fate. By the time a TV standard was finally agreed on, the world was at war. The US government shut down television development and converted the factories to produce radar.
Phil was well aware that there was a war coming, that probably his patents would be expiring before that ended or right around shortly after. And this was very depressing to him. He had put his whole soul and life into getting television to the public.
Phil Farnsworth continued to invent. He earned over 300 patents worldwide. If his atomic fuser had been successful, we might all be flying around in nuclear cars by now. He should be a household name, but despite a cartoon descendant on Futurama, he's not. Unfortunately, Philo T. Farnsworth never profited from his invention. He was squeezed out and did not participate in the growth and development of his beloved television. He refused to watch the damn thing. Then on July 20th, 1969, a miniature version of his original image dissector was used to beam live pictures back to the Earth from the moon.
We were watching it, and Neil Armstrong landed on the moon. Phil turned to me and he says, "Pam, this has made it all worthwhile." Before then, he wasn't too sure.
As a child, I remember being cradled in my great-grandmother's arms, asking her to tell me about Philo and everything he had achieved. This has encouraged me to continue sharing the truth about Philo, and I believe it will inspire a new generation to also believe anything is possible. My name is Jessica, and I'm proud to be the great-granddaughter of both Philo T. Farnsworth and Elma Pem Farnsworth.
So now you know the story of Philo Farnsworth, the most famous man you've never heard of, but certainly his invention, of course, basically is something that we spend a tremendous amount of time absorbing. It is culturally a, excuse me, it's a culturally a, obviously an iconic form of mass communication that is has a profound effect on our culture, on how we see the world. And so if for some reason, by the way, that video doesn't show up on this YouTube link, I'm sorry, on this YouTube recording, it's only because it got taken down because of copyright. So I'll make sure I include the link in the Canvas shell. So anyway, we move on. So RCA sued Farnsworth over Zworykin's iconoscope patent, and as you heard, lost and had to license patents from Farnsworth. The analog standard, by the way, which was a set of technical standards of how TVs would kind of operate and work and transmit, were adopted in 1941 during World War II. So there's some reference to that in that video on Philo Farnsworth. By the way, the digital standard, which basically takes a signal, a television signal, and puts it into a binary code of zeros and ones, because that's how the digital works. That was actually adopted in 2009. So what's interesting is from the FCC adopted the analog standard, and it was also based on radio waves for all US sets in 1941. And most countries, with the exception of Europe and Asia, developed a superior technical system called PAL. So if you've ever gotten into editing, frame rates are different. Sometimes there's a difference between NTSC, which is analog here in the US, and then PAL in Europe. So it's very engineered. It's very technical. I don't need to dive into it because honestly, that's not a critical thing that you really need to know about in this particular class. I apologize. I got I'm shaking off a head cold here. Anyway, let's talk about though the fact that there was a TV licensing freeze until 1952. And the reason that is because in the early days, much like radio, where radio developed pretty quickly and was somewhat haphazard in where a signal would land on the spectrum, if you will, the same thing was happening in television, right? And so basically in the early parts of I would say the of television's development, there was essentially licenses. There were being television licenses being put out there, and essentially you had TV stations that were going up and they were interfering. Their signal was interfering with other TV stations. So there had to be, the FCC had to step in and issue 100 licenses, and then later froze those licenses until 1952. I'll talk a little bit about RCA and its first successful color broadcast system here in just a second. But I do want to get back to this thing about assigning frequencies and freezing TV licenses. So TV stations were limited in a city or market due to signal interference. So basically, if you lived in like a New York, a Chicago, a Los Angeles, you actually, before this licensing freeze took hold, there were stations that you could actually tune into and watch. Now, remember, I don't know if I mentioned this like way back when, but the very first televisions were only 7 inches. Like now they're what, 60 or even bigger, but they were, they were teeny tiny. The reception wasn't great, but it was television. And in 1948, there was a freeze from 1948 to 52. So what did that mean? Well, basically during the freeze, New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles having several stations, other areas had none. So this is kind of interesting. In non-TV cities, movie audiences increased. That makes sense, right? Because if you don't have television in your area, you're still going to be relying on film, right? Because we're going to get to talking about film here after spring break, or if you're watching this in the fall, certainly later in the fall. Basically, film, was the big dog before television came along. And then once television comes along, think about it. Instead of having to go to the theater, constantly go to the theater to watch entertainment, you can just stay at home in your living room and watch it. We still do that today, right? It's just a convenience thing. So in non-TV cities, movie audiences increased. Cities with television stations, listen to this, saw a 20 to 40% drop in movie attendance. So basically, if you were in New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, these big markets with obviously with television, access to television, you were more apt to stay home and watch television than go see a film. It even extended out to taxi and nightclub attendance, which also fell. So people were staying home. Library circulation, people reading, checking out books from the library, that dropped too because more people were watching television, right? And last but not least, radio listening also declined. So television really was kind of swallowing up, kind of the big whale early on in terms of how people were opting to spend not only their money, but their time, right? All right. As far as color television goes, something we take for granted these days, in 1952, the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, approved CBS's color system, but TVs kind of weren't ready for it yet. So it wasn't until 1954 that RCA / NBC introduced its color system. That's why you see that little peacock symbol, and that's why you have Peacock Network. That goes back, that has its roots back in the early 50s. Now, what's interesting is color television really didn't become widespread until the 1960s. That's why when you see 50s kind of programming, it's by and large in black and white. But color does, trace its roots back to the 1950s. All right, how about content, right? How does that develop? Well, we're going to get into genre here in a little bit, but early television programming, right, was very much on television like it was on radio. And so whereas television really took everything that radio was known for, and it did, and it also not only did it take all the content it was known for, but at the very early on, it took all of the sort of economic structure from it as well, or at least or stole a page from it, right? So early television programs often had single sponsors, right? Networks lacked control, so they made so basically what happened here is, like, you have the Milton Berle Texaco Star Theater, right? So one sponsor, right, bankrolling the show. Oftentimes those there was obviously regularly scheduled programming, but that programming, guys, was like significantly less in terms of duration. So a show might be, for example, 15 minutes or 20 minutes or 25 minutes, simply because you had one sponsor. Well, obviously network people, right? Well, look, David Sarnoff, remember him from our radio days? William Paley, the head of CBS, right? Basically, they wanted to diminish a sponsor's role, right? They wanted to increase the ability for a network to not only, have more, control in terms of the content, but also in terms of the finances. So if I back up, for example, in 1952, a single 1 hour TV show cost a sponsor about $35,000, a figure that rose to $90,000 by the end of the decade. And so Sarnoff and Paley basically developed two new types of programs to kind of counteract this. One was called the magazine format. The other one was called a TV spectacular, which greatly helped networks gain control over content. So magazine formatted shows, which were news, talk, comedy, music, right? Basically, the first one you may have heard of, and is still on the air today, 1952, was the NBC introduced the Today Show, which was a 3-hour news talk program, right? In 1954, NBC also created the Tonight Show, okay? Because they were daily shows rather than weekly, studio production costs were prohibitive for a single sponsor. So if you were a Texaco, for example, trying to sponsor a show, it was really not financially feasible to sponsor these 3-hour shows on a daily basis. It just costs too much money to bankroll that. So the point being made here is that it allowed Sarnoff and Paley and these executives to go out and start recruiting multiple advertisers for multiple shows, which raised significant amounts of more money. And it also meant that not one particular sponsor had complete control over the actual content of that show, and therefore, would have a major say in what a network could run, right, as far as content wise. So NBC offered spot ads within the shows. Advertisers paid the network for 30 to 60-second time slots. Of course, we still see that today. And the network, not the sponsor, produced and owned the programs or bought them from independent producers. So that also led to the TV Spectacular, which was a television special, which used to be, a mainstay on television growing up for me. Broadway's Peter Pan came to television, multiple spots with multiple sponsors. A 1955 TV version of Peter Pan drew 65 million viewers. Other specials included music variety shows and annual live specials. Well, also during this time, speaking of one sponsor, one show, there was the popularity and the spectacular rise and fall of primetime quiz shows, right? They were cheap to produce because technically you didn't have to pay actors. It was, you spent all your money on maybe a set and music for the show, etc. Right? And they were extremely popular, right? It was America's one of those was the $64,000 question, which was inspired by a radio program. It was prime time, so it was in that 8 to 11 o'clock hour, sponsored by Revlon. By 1958, 22 quiz shows aired on network television. Revlon, who sponsored them, had sales jump 1,000% by 1959. But here is the problem. There was a infamous quiz show scandals, right? Because you had contestants being fed the answers so that they would continue to win, which would continue to generate interest. I mean, I think of it, in terms of, Jeopardy. Ken Jennings, that champion that was on Jeopardy. There was another one recently that went on a long run. And think about all the buzz that was created by that. Well, that was happening in the 1950s. The only difference is that it was literally bullshit. Sorry, pardon my French. And basically, it essentially led to the fall of quiz shows, because suddenly everyone who was thinking that these quiz shows were kind of on the up and up suddenly realized that they were being duped. It put, the sponsors didn't want to have anything to do with it. There was also this notion during the same time that these types of shows were not culturally sophisticated. And this kind of proved that point, if you will. I'm not saying that I believe that, but that was what the critics were saying. And it basically just essentially sort of defined sort of the differences between what's called the high and low culture attitudes toward television, right? High culture being the people that would go to a live theater or they go see a fine film. They always had kind of like, they would look down at people that, the masses that like television. Well, certainly giving them ammo with a quiz show scandal, did not help, right? And eventually a congressional investigation, popped up over this, and the, quiz shows were, pretty much gone. And then they started coming back. We had one, late 90s, early 2000s, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? But basically the idea of a quiz show really sort of fell off there for a while. All right. Let's talk about cable television, because that's got another, we talk about television evolution in history. You cannot ignore this, the fact that cable TV certainly shares a big part of it. The first cable systems were called CATV, or Community Antenna Television. That's what CATV stands for, Community Antenna Television. It originated in the late 40s in Oregon, Pennsylvania, New York, where mountains or tall buildings block TV signals. So if you lived in New York City, for example, or you lived in, my dad, by the way, couldn't get cable because, for years he had a house in the high mountains of Colorado, just outside Denver. And so he actually had to get a satellite dish and not get cable. So getting television to his house was always kind of interesting. So, but the difference being is that, cable then expanded out to not just people in cities and areas where it was difficult to try to get in, where an antenna couldn't reach, but it became obviously something that became more widespread. But anyway, these systems early on served 10% of the country and contained just 12 channels. But TV sales personnel, broadcasters, and electronic firms saw big advantages of cable, right? Each channel was separate, thus avoiding over-the-air interference, and the ability to increase channel capacity because of running signals through actual, what's called coaxial cable, right? So cable also delivered clear reception, but it did rely on wires. Now, a big game changer, by the way, during this time was the fact that we launched our first, AT&T launched its first satellite into orbit in 1960. And it was the first communication satellite capable of receiving and amplifying signals, and it obviously cable benefited from it. Advances in satellite technology in the 1970s dramatically changed the fortunes of cable by creating a reliable system for the distribution and programming to cable companies across the nation. The first cable network to use satellites for regular transmission of TV programming was HBO. That was back in 1972, by the way. And eventually HBO started off with movies. Then it started delivering uncut, uncut commercial-free movies, exclusive live coverage of major boxing matches, and people paid for it. I think that was what's most, it was a premium pay service that you could pay for on top of your cable, and people were willing to pay for it. And of course, still do today. I have a HBO Max account that I rely on. Well, HBO was the first, but then we had WTBS, a station in Atlanta went national, WGN in Chicago, right? These all became very much a part of the cable landscape. ESPN is created in the early 1980s. Of course, CNN, comes along in the early 80s as well. And so you had all these cable networks that were becoming national. And you can see that the growth goes pretty quickly. By 1977, there's cable in 14% of homes. By 1985, that's 46%. And by 1997, cable has surpassed primetime network programming, meaning that basically the shows that were being watched on cable, which is a paid service, were actually drawing higher ratings and more people than something for free. And that's something pretty typical today by a wide margin if you look at Netflix versus what's watched on network television. All right. Also, cable introduced what's called narrowcasting. So the fact that you had all these different channels that you could offer, much more so than network television, you could find different, you could find a niche. You could find a different subject to have that cable channel be. So like CNN for news, ESPN for sports. You had MTV at one point. We talked about that in, I believe, chapter 4 was, the history of sound. That was a dedicated music channel. You had Food Network. You have, Bravo. I mean, it goes on and on and on. And so it kind of followed sort of the pattern of what we would, if we would talk about magazine semester, people pick up different magazines or go to different blogs for specific topics. Well, it's very much the same for cable television. And if you're watching, say, like an ESPN, advertisers, companies, ESPN and advertisers can find each other so that whoever is watching, they develop an idea of who that person is, what their age is, what their sex is, what their what they might be interested in terms of buying. And that's why cable television is so appealing in many ways to, or was to advertisers. By 1999, by the way, cable penetration had hit 70%. But of course, starting in the mid 90s, it begins losing market share first to what's called dish and direct television, actual direct broadcast satellite, the small satellite dishes. Don't know if you still have direct TV or dish network, but certainly I've seen a diminishment in these things because of obviously modern YouTube and whatnot and streaming content. But in any event, cable's heyday was at the end of the 1990s, and really it begins with dish and direct TV. And then once we get into streaming, cable television taking the even bigger hit. So in any event, direct broadcast satellite, which was transmitting a signal directly to a satellite dish at a customer's home. It reduced cable penetration. It began scrambling signals to prevent free access to broadcast. So at one point, if you owned a satellite dish, you could see a lot of free stuff. And then, networks and companies that were utilizing these satellites to broadcast their content to customers got smart, started, scrambling this stuff, and you couldn't see it. Okay. Home video also taking a slice out of, I guess not just cable, but the fact is that it was spreading the audience thinner, right? So remember when I first started in part one, I talked about network television having 90% of sort of the market share in the early 70s. Well, it obviously diminishes greatly because cable offers all these different channels you can watch. Well, what about home video, right? So many reasons why home video was good and bad for the television industry. Bad if you're a network. Well, I wouldn't say bad. It was tough because basically once the feds basically permitted home taping for personal use, not only were people recording movies, but they were recording shows to watch back at a different time. And so it made it very difficult very early on for networks to kind of like essentially determine how many people were watching shows at any given moment. Certainly being the ability to watch a movie in your house meant that a lot of people at night or whenever they were watching television were really they might be watching first run movies, or at least movies that have been in the theater very recently, as opposed to watching actual television content. So there was a lot of, there was a lot of angst over home video on many different levels. But what it did lead to was this idea of time shifting, which is the notion that we can watch back stuff whenever it's convenient for us. That was not always the case, right? Certainly it is the case now. It's on what I call on demand. Basically, you can watch, if you're a fan of The Bachelor, for example, you can record The Bachelor and then watch it back, that night. You can watch it back in a series, 3 or 4 weeks later. You can watch it back a year from now. That's the beauty of time shifting. So now I'm just watching Ozark season 3, which I think has been out for over a year, right? Time shifting. All right. Let me catch up on my notes here. Okay, guys, let's talk about the third screen. A couple more concepts here, and then we'll be done with this part. All right, so first screen, okay, film, movie theater, that's your first screen. Second screen, television, monitor, right? Looking at a TV, that's your second screen. Third screen refers to viewing content on computer screen. So I'm on a computer now. I'm looking at a third screen. For television, third screen viewing, computer viewing, is generally used as a catch-up service, meaning not catch-up as in the stuff you pour in a hamburger, but basically that you're likely watching television content on your computer. You're not generally watching it live. You more likely, in all likelihood, are watching on your smart TV, which would still be, I think, in many ways, well, It's either going to be, well, it's more fourth screen. So third screen is basically a catch-up service. You can watch all of these sites: YouTube, iTunes, Hulu, Netflix, Disney Plus, ESPN Plus, whatever. These are all things that, you can watch on a computer. Cable TV giants are also making programs available online. So Xfinity TV, Paramount Plus, HBO Max. Then it's limitless. You can watch a lot of these things on your computer, but you can also watch them on your fourth screen, which is what we're really, for the most part, I think, doing the most of these days, which is fourth screen technology. So I guess third screen, this is debatable, right? Would you consider your television at home? It's a smart television, right? Where you can watch different things like network television, cable. You can watch your streaming services. Would you consider that second screen? Would you consider that third screen? I don't know. That's a really, or it's a hybrid, right? Because on a fourth screen, which is a smartphone, this guy, right, or an iPad, that is on the go. It's mobile. But what's interesting is you can also take your phone and you can throw whatever you're watching on your phone to your television in your living room or in your garage like I do. So it's all very muddled. But anyway, technically speaking, a fourth screen is a smartphone or mobile video. It has forced major changes in consumer viewing habits, right? It's given us all sorts of power in terms of when we want to watch our content, where. I think it's amazing. By the way, by 2014, 84% of smartphone and tablet owners use these devices as an additional screen while watching television at the same time. So that means that you're watching something on television and at the same time also got a phone in your hand watching something else, right? Kind of crazy. But anyway, the multifunctionality and portability means viewers may no longer need TV sets. Okay, you probably need the internet, but maybe you don't watch your stuff on television. I still do because I like the big size of it, but that's just me. All right, so I am going to stop there because we are going to get into major programming trends in part 3, genres of television. I think you'll find it quite fascinating, and there's going to be some accompanying links that you will watch on YouTube with it. But that is essentially the evolution of television. Now we're going to talk about the evolution of our how we watch and what we watch on television, and obviously streaming platforms that have a basis in television. So I will see you back here for part 3 very shortly, or whenever you decide to watch it during this particular module.